Great. So, hi everyone. Thank you so much for joining my session, and special thanks also to Techno Day for inviting me. It's super special for me to present on the International Women's Day, and I hope that you enjoy my session. I'm going to talk about how to write automated tests with a library called sa11y to test for accessibility issues in your web applications. My name is Alba Rivas. I am a developer evangelist, well, now advocate, we call us advocates now, at Salesforce. And this is my email and my Twitter handle in case that you want to contact me later or in case that you have any questions about the talk. This is the forward-looking statement slide. It's a slide that we have to use in Salesforce because we are a publicly traded company, and it just means that you should make purchases based on the functionality that's currently available, but no worries because everything that I'm going to talk about today is generally available. So what are we going to see today? In this talk, I'm going to be covering how to write automated tests for accessibility in your web applications using a library called sa11y. I'm going to do a demo because sa11y is really a set of libraries, and one of the libraries helps you write out accessibility tests using Jest framework. So I'm going to do a demo of how to use sa11y Jest. I'm not going to be covering things like an introduction to accessibility, but I want to recommend you a place in which you can learn a lot from accessibility best practices and an introduction to them, which is Trailhead. Trailhead is our learning platform in which you can tackle modules, trails. It's like a gamified experience in which you are going to earn points and you can have a hands-on experience. So it's really easy to learn there and really fun, right? And I'm not going to be covering manual testing for accessibility. That's something that needs to be done as well, but that's something that I'm not going to cover today because the time is a bit short. So I said that I come from Salesforce. I need to explain what Salesforce is because sa11y has been created by Salesforce and we use it internally, but you can use it also externally in applications that are not related to Salesforce at all. But at least I want to give you a quick introduction. So Salesforce, if you don't know it, is the #1 CRM in the world, right? And it's also an application development platform. We have products for sales, service, marketing, and more. And I'm mostly working on the platform side of things, and that's the reason I'm sharing development best practices in this presentation, right? So in Salesforce, we have a strong commitment towards accessibility. We want our products to be easy to use by people with all abilities. And that's why we have an accessibility team, a team which is dedicated to product accessibility. This team watches out that products enforce accessibility best practices to the extent possible. And when I'm going to talk about accessibility best practices in this presentation, I refer to those best practices that are part of the Section 508 of the Rehabilitation Act, and also those that are part of the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. Concretely, we try to target versions 2.0 and levels, the level AA. As I told you, we try to make our products comply with accessibility best practices. And if you want to take a look at the status of every individual product, we have published accessibility conformance reports for every of our products, and you can take a look there. Okay, so with that, let's talk about sa11y. sa11y is a set of JavaScript libraries that allow you to write automated accessibility tests, right? sa11y is something that we use internally at Salesforce to make sure that our products conform to those accessibility best practices, but it's also an open source set of libraries that you can use in your web applications that nothing had to do with Salesforce, right? sa11y uses Axe Core internally, which is a testing framework for accessibility. And what we add on top of Axe Core is a set of preset rules that you can configure. You can pick like the base one or a more restrictive one. We add libraries that allow you to write accessibility tests very easily when using Jest for unit testing, or when using WebDriver IO, which is what we use for integration testing. And you can use sa11y also in generic JavaScript. So what about the name? The name stands for Salesforce plus Ali, right? And Ali is, well, if you don't know this, I didn't know before preparing this tag and getting into the world of accessibility. So normally accessibility is shortened as Ali. And this is because this word is a numeronym. There are 11 letters between the A and the Y, and that's why it's Ali, right? Okay, so sa11y is going to help you detect a big number of accessibility issues that your web applications may have. For instance, it may help you detect if you are using a correct semantic structure of the DOM, if you are using ARIA attributes correctly, right? And many more issues that you may unintentionally doing in your web development. There are, as I told you, there are like 3 libraries that you can use with sa11y, right? And in the case of WebDriver IO, there are a couple more issues that we can detect, because with WebDriver IO, we are using a real browser instead of JS DOM, which is what we use, for instance, with Jest. And there are a couple more issues that you can detect. But it is important to know that not all accessibility issues are detectable by a machine, right? So sa11y is just one of the steps that can help you make sure that your applications are accessible or follow accessibility best practices. But if you want to be completely sure, you will need to perform some manual testing in looking for other kinds of accessibility issues, right? So with that, I'm going to show you the demo. Let's go to Visual Studio Code, which is the IDE that we normally use for Salesforce development. Here I have a project that I have created for Salesforce. In Salesforce, we use a front-end framework called Lightning Web Components. It's a web components framework that we have created indeed. And this is the scaffolding, the regular scaffolding for the project. But as I told you, you can use sa11y just in other kinds of projects. This is something that is published in NPM. You can install it like running an npm install and the name of the module, but I have set up all the configuration already in this project because, again, we don't have much time, right? So you can see here that in my dev dependencies, I'm using the sa11y Jest module. I'm using Jest because this is the framework that we recommend to use for unit testing Lightning Web Components, right? And then the next thing that you will have to do is to register the matcher that is going to allow you execute those tests that test for accessibility issues. This is something that you could do on each individual test file, but for simplicity, what we did was to create a configuration file. And this configuration file is something that we load as part of our Jest configuration. That way, this code is going to execute every time that we run a test, and we are able to use the matcher in our tests directly. So here I have a Lightning Web Component. Probably you are not familiar with Lightning Web Components, but you are going to understand it very easily, because this is just, I'm going to close this and I'm going to make it a bit bigger. Yeah, so this is just the HTML file in which we define the view that we want the component to have, right? And here what we are doing is to, if the details are visible, we're going to see now that this is a property, we are showing some markup, right? We are rendering some markup. If we take a look at the JavaScript file of the web component, we see that here is where we define the property are details visible, and we are decorating this property with a decorator called API that is making the property public. This means that from the outside, we are going to be able to control that property. Why do I explain all this? Because it is important that you test for the different configurations that your DOM may have. This is, if I want to make sure that Sally tests that everything in here is accessible, I need to check, or I need to set this property to true, so that my JS DOM implementation renders these inner elements of the section. Hope that it makes sense for you. So what about the test? This is a test file that I have created previously, right? And here we are using Jest. With Jest, you normally define the test in this way, right? You say, I want to test that this component is accessible. And for that, I'm going to create a series of elements, basically my web component. I'm going to instantiate my web component. I'm going to add it to the document, right? And then I'm going to perform whatever assertions I want to perform. In this case, what I told you before, very important to make those details visible so that Sally is able to inspect all the possible elements that we may have in our markup. So here for the assertion, I'm using the Sally matcher. The Sally matcher is the one that is going to run all those rules that we have configured in our preset, the one that we have selected, right? And it's going to test that this element here is following accessibility best practices. One important thing here is also to wait for the matcher to finish its work, because it's something that is going to run asynchronously, right? So we need to invoke this function asynchronously. So now what I'm going to do is that I'm going to open the command line and I'm going to run the test of my application. I could do it like using other features in Visual Studio Code, but I'm going to do it this way for simplicity. Okay, so now my test has run and the test has failed. Why? Because Sally has detected that there is an accessibility issue. Sally has detected that I'm using heading levels that are increasing by more than one step. And that's completely true, because if I go back to my HTML file, we are going to see that here I was using an H1 and then I was using an H3. And this is considered an accessibility bad practice. So now what I'm going to do is that I'm going to fix the issue, right? And I'm going to run the test again. And when I run the test again, we are going to see that now my test passed correctly. Right, so let's go back to our presentation. And I'm gonna tell you some best practices regarding Sally automated test. So first of all, I already talked about this it's important that you test for the different DOM configurations, the different configurations that your component or your web page may have, right? It's important that you open all the different sections and that you test for all the possible elements that may be rendered in your component. Also, it is important to test for different states. So, for instance, when you have sections that are collapsible or expandable sections, the ARIA standard determines that you need to use certain ARIA attributes, right, to indicate that a section has been collapsed or it is expanded. And there is something that we want our sa11y test to check. So ideally, we would need to test one test for checking that a section is collapsed and another test for checking that a section is expanded. That's important. Remember to wait for to be accessible to execute, because if you don't wait for it, then you may, well, your test will pass basically, and that doesn't mean that you are following accessibility best practices, but that you implemented the test badly. And remember as well that there are some issues that cannot be detected with JSDOM. So for those issues, it's recommended to also write integration test with WebDriver IO. Takeaways from this presentation. Well, you saw how sa11y can help you detect a big portion of accessibility issues. And if you include it in your CI pipeline, then you are going to make sure that a developer who's changing the HTML file of a component, for instance, is not introducing unexpectedly an accessibility issue, right? Also remember that you can use it as of today for just WebDriver IO or also generic JavaScript. And one takeaway that was important for me is that by using sa11y, you are going to learn accessibility best practices, because I worked on a project to implement sa11y in some applications, some sample applications that my team has, and I learned a ton just by taking a look at the issues that sa11y had detected. I want to leave you here some resources. First of all, you have the sa11y repo. This is something open source that you can clone now, right away. Then I leave you also a link here to Salesforce sample gallery. Remember, I told you I worked on a project to implement sa11y in some sample apps that we have for Salesforce. So this is the page in which you have all the sample apps. And if you go to GitHub for each sample app, right, here you can see that I implemented sa11y for all the sample apps, and you can take a look at that and how I wrote the test for the different Lightning Web Components that we have. That's here in Lightning Web Components. For instance, here, all the Lightning Web Components are using sa11y. For instance, this one, and look for the different configurations, right? Here, when we are able to render a map, or here when we weren't able to render a map and we are showing an error instead. So I leave you there the link, because I think it's an interesting implementation of sa11y. Also, I leave you here a link to a blog post I wrote talking about all this in the Salesforce developer site. And finally, a link to a blog that the Salesforce UX team has in Medium, in which they have written several blog posts to talk about accessibility that you may find interesting. Finally, I want to ask you to connect with us, right? You can navigate to our developer site, in which we have the blog posts, podcast, and in which we publish many developer-related content, mostly for Salesforce, but also sometimes for things, applications, for instance, web applications that run on Heroku or that are not strictly related to Salesforce, Node.js, etc., etc. If you like this talk, please connect with me on Twitter. You can also connect on Twitter with Salesforce Devs, which is my team, or Salesforce UX or Salesforce Ally, and tell us what you think about Sally. Ask us any issues that you have with the tool, and provide whatever feedback you want to provide. And finally, we are also in some other places as Facebook, LinkedIn, and YouTube. I recommend you to subscribe to the YouTube channel and click on the bell to receive notifications, because we are constantly publishing videos like this one that you are watching today. Thank you so much again for listening to me, and I hope that you enjoy the session and that you have a good rest of the day. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.